readers, welcome back to Reads with Ruby with me, Ruby, and
Robert,
my usual partner in Word Crimes for our read of Oliver Twist. And today we are on chapter 23. And because it's rather longer than other chapters recently, it will be the only chapter for this video.
just
Yeah, 7 pages.
so 7 very uncomfortable pages.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the beetle gets a bit... Yeah. Not good. Anyway, chapter 23, which contains the substance of a pleasant conversation between Mr. Bumble and a lady, and shows that even a beetle may be susceptible on some points. The night was bitter cold. The snow lay on the ground, frozen into a thick, hard crust, so that only heaps had drifted into byways and corners that were affected by the sharp wind that howled abroad, which, as if expending increased fury on such prey as it had found, caught it up in savage clouds, and whirling it into 1,000 misty eddies, scattered into the air. Bleak, dark, and piercing cold, it was a night for the well-housed and well-fed to draw round the bright fire and thank God they were at home, and for the homeless, starving wretch to lay down and die. Many hunger-worn outcasts had closed their eyes in our bare streets at such times. Let their crimes have been what they may, they can hardly open them to a more bitter world.
Such was the aspect of out-of-doors affairs when Miss Corny, the matron of the workhouse, to which our readers have been already introduced as the birthplace of Oliver Twist, sat herself down before a cheerful fire in her own little room, and glanced with no small degree of complacency at a small round table on which stood a tray of corresponding-sized furnishings, with all necessary materials for the most grateful meal the matrons enjoyed. In fact, Miss Corny was about to solace herself with a cup of tea as she glanced from the table to the fireplace, where the smallest of all possible kettles was singing a small song in a small voice. Her inward satisfaction had evidently increased, so much so indeed that Miss Corny smiled.
"Well,"
said the matron, leaning her elbow on the table and looking reflectively at the fire,
"I'm sure we all have a great deal to be grateful for. A great deal, if we but did know about it.
Miss Corny shook her head mournfully, as she deploring the mental blindness of those paupers who did not know it, and thrusting a silver spoon, private property, into the innermost recesses of a 2-ounce tin tea caddy, proceeded to make the tea.
How slight a thing will disturb the equanimity of our frail minds." The black teapot, being very small and easily filled, ran over while Miss Corny was moralizing, and water slightly scalded Miss Corny's hand.
"Drat the pot!" said
said the worthy matron, setting it down very hastily on the hob.
"A little stupid thing that only holds a couple cups. What use is it of any to anybody except
said Miss Corny, pausing.
Except a poor, desolate creature like me? Oh dear."
With these words, the matron dropped into her chair, and once more resting her elbow on the table, thought of her solitary fate. The small teapot, the single cup, had awakened in her mind some sad recollections of Mr. Corny, who had not been dead more than 25 years, and she was overpowered.
"I shall never get another,"
said Miss Corny pettishly.
"I shall never get another like him."
Whether this remark was reference to the husband or the teapot is uncertain. It might have been the latter, for Miss Corny looked at it when she spoke, and took it up afterwards. She had just tasted her first cup when she was disturbed by a soft tap at the door.
"Oh, come in with you,"
said Miss Corny sharply.
"Some old woman dying, I suppose. They always die when I'm at meals. Don't stand there letting the cold air in, don't. What's amiss now, eh?"
"Nothing, ma'am. Nothing's amiss,"
replied a man's voice.
"Dearie me,"
exclaimed the matron in a much sweeter tone.
"is that Mr. Bumble?"
At your service, ma'am,
said Mr. Bumble, who had been stopping outside to rub his shoes clean and shake the snow off his coat, who had now made his appearance, and bearing the cocked hat in one hand and a bundle in the other.
Shall I shut the door, ma'am?
The lady modestly hesitated to reply, lest there be any impropriety in holding an interview with Mr. Bumble with the doors closed. And Mr. Bumble, taking advantage of the hesitation, and being very cold himself, shut it without further permission.
Hard weather, Mr. Bumble?
Said the matron.
Hard indeed, ma'am,
replied the beadle.
Anti-parochial weather this, ma'am. We have given away, Miss Courtney, we've given away a matter of 20 quartern loaves and cheese and a half this very blessed afternoon, and yet them paupers are no content.
Of course not. When would they be, Mr. Bumble?
Said the matron,
sipping her tea.
Yes. When indeed, ma'am?
Rejoined Mr. Bumble.
Why, here one man that, in consideration for his wife and large family, had a quartern loaf and a good pound of cheese, full weight, and is grateful. Is he grateful, ma'am? He is grateful. Not a copper farthing worth of it. What does he do, ma'am, but ask for a few coals? If it's not only a pocket handkerchief full, he says, coals. What would he do with coals? Toast his cheese with them, and then come back for more. What's the way with these people, ma'am? Give 'em an apron full of coals today, and they'll come back for another a day after tomorrow. They're brazen as alabaster.
The matron expressed her entire concurrence in this intelligible simile, but the beadle went on.
I never,
said Mr. Bumble.
See anything like the pitch? It's got to. The day out of 4 yesterday, a man. You have been a married woman, ma'am, and I may mention it to you. A man with hardly a rag upon his back. Here, Miss Corney looked at the floor. Goes to our overseas door when he has got company coming for dinner, and says he must be relieved, Miss Courtney, as he wouldn't go away, and shocked the company very much. Our overseas sent him a pound of potatoes and half a pint of oatmeal.
My heart,
said the ungrateful villain.
What use is this to me? You might as well give me a pair of iron spectacles.
Very good,
says our overseer, taking him away again.
You won't get anything else here.
Then I'll die in the streets,
says the vagrant.
Oh no, you won't,
says our overseer.
Ha ha! That was very good. So like Mr. Garnet, wasn't it?
Interposed the matron.
Well, Mr. Bumble?
Well, ma'am?
Rejoined the beadle.
He went away and he did die in the streets. There's an obstinate pauper for you.
It beats anything I could have believed,
observed the matron emphatically.
But you don't think out-of-door relief a very bad thing anyway, do you, Mr. Bumble? You're a gentleman of experience and ought to come to know.
Miss Courtney,
said the beadle, smiling as men smile who are conscious of superior information.
Out-of-door relief, properly managed, ma'am, is the parochial safeguard. The great principle of out-of-door relief is to give the paupers exactly what they don't want, and then they get tired of coming.
Dear me.
Well, that's a good one too.
Oops, exclaimed Miss Courtney.
Exclaimed Miss Courtney.
Well, that's a good one too.
Yes, Brexwit.
Betwixt.
Betwixt. I can never get that one right. You and me, ma'am.
Mr. Bumble returned.
That's the great principle. That's the reason why, if you look at any cases that get into them audacious newspapers, you'll always observe that the sick families have been relieved with slices of cheese. That the rule now, Miss Corney, all over the country. But however,
said the beadle, stooping to unpack his bundle,
these are official secrets, ma'am. Do not be spoke of except, as I may say, among the parochial officers, such as ourselves. This is the port wine, ma'am, that the board ordered for the infirmary. Real fresh, genuine port wine, only out of the cask this forenoon, clear as a bell and no sediment.
Having held the first bottle up to the light and shaken it well to test its excellence, Mr. Bumble placed them both upon the chest of drawers, folding the handkerchief in which they had been wrapped up, and putting it carefully into his pocket, and took up his hat as if to go.
You'll have a very cold walk, Mr. Bumble,
said Matron.
It blows, ma'am.
Replied Mr. Bumble, turning up his coat collar.
Enough to cut one's ear off.
The matron looked at the little kettle and looked to the beetle, who was moving towards the door, and the beetle coughed in a proprietary way to bidding her good night, and bashfully inquired whether he wouldn't have a cup of tea.
Mr. Bumble instantly turned back his collar again, laid his hat and stick upon a chair, and drew another chair up to the table. As he slowly seated himself, he looked at the lady. She fixed her eyes upon the little teapot. Mr. Bumble coughed again and slightly smiled.
Miss Corny rose to get another cup and saucer from the closet. As she sat down again, her eyes once again encountered those of the gallant beetle. She coloured, and applied herself to the task of making his tea. Again Mr. Bumble coughed, louder this time than he had yet coughed.
Sweet Mr. Bumble?
Inquired the matron, taking up the sugar basin.
Very sweet indeed, ma'am,
replied Mr. Bumble, fixing his eyes on Miss Corny as he said this. And if ever a beetle looked tender, Mr. Bumble was that beetle at that moment.
The tea was made and handed in silence, Mr. Bumble having spread a handkerchief over his knees to prevent the crumbs from sullying the splendour of his shorts, began to eat and drink, varying these amusements, occasionally by fetching a deep sigh, which, however, had no injurious effect upon his appetite, but, on the contrary, rather seemed to facilitate his operations in the tea and toast department.
I see you have a cat, ma'am,
said Mr. Bumble, glancing at one who, in the centre of her family, was basking before the fire.
And kittens too, I declare.
I am so fond of them, Mr. Bumble, you can't think,
replied the matron.
They're so happy, so frolicsome, and so cheerful that they are quite companions for me.
Very nice animals, ma'am,
replied the Bumble approvingly. Replied Mr. Bumble.
So very domestic. And there is the matron and Mr. Bumble taking tea with the cat.
Oh, yes.
Yes, the cat. Rejoined the matron with enthusiasm.
So fond of their home, too, that it's quite a pleasure, I'm sure.
Miss Corny, ma'am,
said Mr. Bumble slowly, marking the time with his teaspoon.
I mean to say this, ma'am, that any cat or kitten that could live with you, ma'am, and not be fond of its home, must be an ass, ma'am.
Oh, Mr. Bumble,
remonstrated Mrs. Corny.
It's of no use discussing the fact, ma'am. Disguising the fact, ma'am,
said Mr. Bumble slowly, flourishing with the teaspoon, with a kind of amorous dignity that made him doubly impressive.
This man. My brain looks at this going, I really don't want to continue, but...
You've got to.
I would drown it myself with pleasure.
Then you're a cruel man,
said the matron vivaciously. Vivaciously as she held out her hand for the beetle's cup.
And a very hard-hearted man besides.
Hard-hearted, ma'am?
said Mr. Bumble.
Hard?
Mr. Bumble resigned his cup without another word, and squeezed Miss Corny's little finger as she took it, and inflicting two open-handed slaps upon his lace waistcoat with and gave a mighty sigh, and hitched his chair a very little morsel further from the fire. It was a round table, and as Miss Courtney and Mr. Bumble had been sitting opposite each other, with no great space in between them, and fronting the fire, it will be seen that Mr. Bumble, in receding from the fire, and still keeping at the table, increased the distance increased the distance between himself and Miss Corny, which proceeding some prudent readers will doubtless be disposed to admire, and consider the act a great deal of heroism on Mr. Bumble's part, and being in some sort of tempted, and he being in some sort tempted by time, place, and opportunity to give utterance of certain soft things, which, however, while they may become the lips and light of the thoughtless, do seem immeasurably beneath the dignity of judges of the land, members of Parliament, ministers of state, Lord Mayors, and other great public functionaries, but more particularly beneath the stateliness and gravity of a beadle, who, as is well known, should be in the sternest and most inflexible of them all.
Whenever Mr. Bumble's intentions, however, and none doubt they were of the best,
I doubt they were of the best, but you know.
It unfortunately happened, as it had been twice before remarked, that the table was a round one. Consequently, Mr. Bumble, moving his chair little by little, soon began to diminish the distance between himself and the matron, and continuing to travel round the outer edge of the circle, brought his chair in time close to that in which the matron was seated. Indeed, the two chairs touched, and when they did so, Mr. Bumble stopped.
Now, if the matron had moved her chair to the right, she would have been scorched by the fire, and if to the left, she would have fallen into Mr. Bumble's lap and arms. So, being a discreet matron, and no doubt foreseeing these consequences at a glance, she remained where she was, and handed Mr. Bumble another cup of tea.
Hard-hearted Mrs. Courtney,
said Mr. Bumble, stirring his tea and looking into the matron's face.
Are you hard-hearted, Mrs. Courtney?
Dear me,
exclaimed the matron.
What a very curious question from a single man. What can you want to know for, Mr. Bumble?
The beadle drank his tea to the last drop, finished a piece of toast, whisked the crumbs off his knees, wiped his lips, and deliberately kissed the matron.
Mr. Bumble!
cried the discreet lady in a whisper, for the fright was so great that she had quite lost her voice.
Mr. Bumble, I shall scream.
Mr. Bumble made no reply, but in a slow and dignified manner put his arm round the matron's waist.
As the lady stated her intention of screaming, of course she would have screamed at this additional boldness, but that the exertion was rendered unnecessary by a hasty knocking at the door, which was no sooner heard than Mr. Bumble darted with much agility to the wine bottles and began dusting them with great violence, while the matron sharply demanded to know who was there. It's worthy of remark, as a curious physical instance of efficiency of sudden surprise and counteracting the effects of extreme fear, that her voice had quite recovered all its official asperity.
If you please, mistress,
said a withered old female pauper, hideously ugly, putting her head in at the door.
Old Sally is going fast.
What's that to me?
Angrily demanded the matron.
I can't keep her alive, can I?
No, mistress,
replied the old woman.
Nobody can. She's as far beyond the reach of help. I've seen many people die, little babies and great strong men, and I know when a death a coming well enough. But she's trouble in her mind, and when she fits are not on her, and that not often, for she is dying very well. She said she's got something to go tell, which you must hear. She'll never die quiet till you come, mistress.
At this intelligence, the worthy Mrs. Corney muttered a variety of incentives against old women who couldn't even die without purposely annoying their betters, and muffling herself up in a thick shawl which she had hastily caught up, briefly requested that Mr. Bumble stay till she came back, lest anything particular should occur, and bidding the messenger to walk fast and not be all night hobbling up the stairs, followed her from the room with very ill grace and scolding all the way.
Mr. Bumble's conduct on being left to himself was rather inexplicable. He opened the closet counters and table, counted the teaspoons, weighted the sugar tongs closely, inspected a silver milk pot, and asserted that it was of the genuine metal. And having satisfied his curiosity on these points, put on his cocked hat cornerwise, and danced with much gravity 4 distinct times around the table. Having gone through this very exploratory performance, he took off the cocked hat again, and spreading himself before the fire, with his back towards it, seemed to be mentally engaged in taking an exact inventory of the furniture.
So that we will leave Mr. Bumble taking his inventory, and we will end it there, readers. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you will come back next week for our next chapters. Bye for now. Stay safe, be excellent, keep reading.